How does the Russia-Ukraine conflict affect NATO? On May 31st, 2024, President Joe Biden announced a pivotal decision. The United States would permit Ukraine to utilize certain weapons to strike targets within Russian territory. This marks a substantial deviation from prior US policy, which confined the use of American-made weaponry to Ukrainian territory alone. However, this modification is conditional, as Ukraine is authorized to deploy these weapons exclusively in the Kharkiv region, where recent Russian offensives have occurred. This policy adjustment aligns with a broader trend among NATO allies. The decision follows similar measures taken by various NATO countries, including the United Kingdom, which have sanctioned the deployment of provided weapons by Ukraine when deemed necessary. In reaction, Russian President Vladimir Putin articulated his discontent, directing his chief security official, Dmitry Medvedev, to issue a warning to the United States and NATO. Medvedev stated, "Russia considers all long-range weapons used by Ukraine to be under the direct control of NATO troops. This is not military assistance. This is participation in a war against us." He characterized the situation as casus belli, a Latin term denoting justification for military action, potentially escalating into direct conflict between NATO and Russia. Putin aimed to convey a clear message to NATO to cease its involvement in Ukraine or face the risk of military confrontation with the Russian Federation. Notwithstanding these threats, Putin's influence appears to have diminished. 2 months subsequent to Biden's announcement, the United States remains resolute, and NATO unity is increasingly fortified. Ironically, Putin, who sought to undermine NATO, has inadvertently catalyzed the alliance's revitalization, rendering it more robust than it has been since the Cold War. Putin's threats are not unprecedented. 2 months prior to his May 31st warning, he asserted that a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO could precipitate World War III, following French President Emmanuel Macron's suggestion that NATO might deploy troops to Ukraine. Additionally, in February 2024, Politico reported on Putin's ambiguous threats of nuclear retaliation should NATO become directly involved in the conflict. Despite these admonitions, NATO member states have persistently amplified their support for Ukraine, permitting their weapons to be employed against Russian forces. Moreover, Putin has threatened NATO's newest members, Finland and Sweden, attempting to project Russian strength to the 32-nation alliance. However, these endeavors have proven ineffective. As previously noted, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent threats have only succeeded in fortifying NATO, consequently presenting an escalating challenge to Moscow. This context raises a significant inquiry. Why is this phenomenon occurring? To explore this matter, one must first assess NATO's position prior to Putin's consequential decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022. For over a decade preceding the invasion, indications suggested that NATO was inadequately prepared. A salient example is found in remarks made by former US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in February 2010, wherein he proclaimed that NATO was experiencing a state of crisis attributable to financial deficiencies. He contended that budgetary constraints were compromising NATO's effectiveness and exposing it to prospective threats. Gates maintained that many NATO members were insufficiently investing in defense, perceiving this as a symptom of deeper problems regarding the organization's evaluation of global threats. He cited the ongoing war in Afghanistan as a pertinent illustration. While Gates acknowledged NATO's enlargement of troop presence from 30,000 in 2009 to 50,000 in 2010 as a notable achievement, he also highlighted the internal divisions within NATO that hindered collective efforts toward unified objectives. A clear manifestation of this issue is illustrated by the Netherlands, where governmental difficulties arose concerning the deployment of 2,000 troops to Afghanistan, resulting in governmental collapse and subsequent troop withdrawal. Broadly, Robert Gates articulated concerns regarding NATO's European members' increasing inclination toward demilitarization. In a 2010 address at the National Defense University, he cautioned that Europe's hesitance to utilize military force had transitioned from a 20th century advantage to a 21st century impediment to regional security. Gates posited that NATO was evolving into a paper tiger, characterized by substantial theoretical power but deficient practical capabilities. He further noted the potential alienation of the United States by NATO's European members in light of the United States' significant military investments. By 2011, the Atlantic Council had examined these matters, voicing apprehensions regarding NATO's prospective trajectory. In the preceding 2 years, NATO's European members collectively reduced their defense budgets by $45 billion, approximately equal to Germany's entire defense budget at that time, thereby engendering a considerable gap. Throughout the 2010s, the disparity regarding defense expenditure within NATO expanded, with the United States bearing the majority of the financial burden. In 2001, the United States comprised less than half of NATO's total defense expenditure. However, by 2011, this proportion had escalated to nearly 75%. A considerable segment of the US populace perceives that they are financing the demilitarization of Europe, where no immediate threats are recognized. The Atlantic Council indicated that this shift is evident in operational focus, with European members prioritizing soft power initiatives such as humanitarian aid and training, while the United States retains responsibilities for hard power military operations. This imbalance engenders two primary risks: exacerbated division within Europe and a subsequent undermining of the continent's defense apparatus. Notably, not all European members are reducing defense spending, potentially resulting in larger nations becoming the exclusive security providers for the continent as smaller NATO countries curtail their budgets. This undermines NATO's principle of collective defense and sets a precedent for a weakened Europe, ill-equipped to address future threats. At the time, Russia was not regarded as an imminent danger. However, numerous European members exhibited apathy toward prospective defense necessities through funding reductions. This trend persisted throughout the following decade, with European defense budgets continuing to elicit concern. The diminishing perception of threats in Europe weakened NATO, thereby enabling Vladimir Putin to implement more aggressive military strategies. Putin's intentions were elucidated during the 2008 conflict in Georgia and the 2014 annexation of Crimea, which established the groundwork for the subsequent invasion of Ukraine. By 2021, defense analysts advocated for a reassessment of NATO's approach toward Russia. Fyodor A. Lukyanov, editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, contended that the East-West truce, established post-German reunification in 1990, had been systematically breached, attributing this to NATO's expansion. He observed that NATO's primary military focus, collective defense, had been overshadowed by a political agenda. While there is theoretical mutual support, no NATO member anticipates engaging in actual conflict with Russia or defending smaller nations such as Latvia or Slovakia. Lukyanov underscored that NATO's unchanged stance regarding Russia since the 1990s contributed to the crisis of February 2022, which culminated in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This development compelled NATO to re-evaluate its strategy, as Europe could no longer afford further reductions in its defense budget, particularly in light of Putin's historical justifications for the invasion of Ukraine. If Putin can invoke historical grievances to rationalize the invasion of Ukraine, what precludes him from asserting similar claims against NATO members like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all of which are former Soviet states? NATO has been confronted with the challenge of reversing years of declining defense policy in Europe. Even Putin could not have anticipated that his actions would catalyze a comprehensive revival of NATO and the reaffirmation of the organization's fundamental purpose of collective defense. Since the onset of the invasion of Ukraine over 2 years ago, NATO has concentrated on fortifying and augmenting its military capabilities. A pivotal aspect of this strengthening has involved the accession of new members. On April 4, 2023, Finland became NATO's 31st member, with Sweden following suit on March 7, 2024, thereby becoming its 32nd. Both nations had maintained a stance of neutrality throughout the Cold War and its aftermath, opting to eschew formal military alliances in favor of fostering diplomatic relations with both Russia and the West. However, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has prompted a reassessment of their positions, instilling a sense of vulnerability in both countries regarding Moscow's escalating aggression. Historically, Finland confronted a comparable threat in 1939 when the Soviet Union initiated an invasion. Despite several months of resistance, Finland ultimately conceded the eastern province of Karelia, which constitutes approximately 10% of its territory, to Russia. In recent years, Sweden has also perceived a heightened sense of threat. In 2013, Russian bombers conducted simulated attacks on Swedish territory, which prompted NATO intervention. The subsequent year, a Russian submarine was reported to be clandestinely operating within the Stockholm archipelago, further escalating regional tensions. The implications of President Putin's actions were unequivocal. Russia was surveilling and strategizing its forthcoming maneuvers. By 2018, Sweden began disseminating leaflets titled "If Crisis or War Comes," a significant action not undertaken since 1991. In reaction to these perceived threats, NATO has enhanced its military capabilities. Finland, ranked 50th out of 145 nations according to Global Firepower, GFP, maintains a relatively modest standing army comprising 24,000 active personnel. However, its national service policy allows for an extensive reserve force of 870,000 individuals. The Finnish military comprises 164 air assets and over 11,000 armored vehicles, along with the 11th largest navy globally, characterized by 246 naval assets. Sweden, ranked 29th, has a comparable standing army of approximately 24,000 personnel, albeit with a smaller reserve force of 32,900. Sweden optimizes its air and naval capabilities, possessing 212 and 353 assets respectively, and ranks 5th by GFP. The collective naval forces of Finland and Sweden would be pivotal in any potential conflict within the Baltic Sea. President Putin's actions have directly influenced the expansion and enhancement of NATO's military capabilities. Acknowledging this, Putin spent a considerable portion of 2022 asserting that Russia held no territorial disputes with Sweden or Finland. Nevertheless, he cautioned that the deployment of military forces or infrastructure within these nations would necessitate a proportional response from Russia, suggesting a possible escalation of military conflict. Despite these warnings, Finland and Sweden opted to join NATO, thereby concluding decades of neutrality. Putin's incursion into Ukraine instigated a reassessment of defense expenditures among several NATO member states. NATO advocates for member nations to allocate a minimum of 2% of their gross domestic product, GDP, to defense. However, a significant challenge for NATO in recent decades has been the failure of most members to meet this target. In 2014, only 3 countries, the United States, Greece, and the United Kingdom, achieved or exceeded the 2% threshold. This shortfall has resulted in 27 nations lacking the appropriated defense budgets, thereby undermining NATO's collective defense endeavors. By 2024, Luxembourg was recorded as the lowest spender, allocating just under 0.5% of GDP toward defense. Notably, several major European nations also exhibited deficiencies in their military budgets. France allocated approximately 1.8% of GDP to defense, while Germany's expenditure was only £1, 2% in 2014. However, by 2023, following a year of conflict in Ukraine, a shift began to manifest. Nations that had already satisfied the 2% defense spending goal continued to do so alongside Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland, Romania, Hungary, Latvia, and the Slovak Republic, all of which met or exceeded the 2% benchmark. Poland emerged as the highest military spender in NATO as a percentage of GDP, reaching 3.9%, surpassing the United States' 3.49%. Even nations that do not achieve the 2% defense spending target by 2023 are augmenting their defense budgets. Turkey is the sole NATO member that has decreased its defense expenditure as a percentage of GDP since 2014. In July 2024, the BBC reported that NATO anticipates 23 of its 32 members will meet or surpass the 2% defense spending objective by the year's end. Projections indicate that Poland will allocate 1% of its GDP to defense, while Estonia will follow at 4%. The United States, while leading in absolute expenditures, will rank third as a percentage of GDP at 4%. This increase in spending signifies a broader shift in NATO's emphasis following the invasion of Ukraine. European nations that previously lacked military funding and failed to satisfy NATO's mandates are now acutely cognizant of the threat posed by Russia. NATO is preparing for the eventuality that Russia may prevail in Ukraine and subsequently direct its focus towards other areas of Europe. Although this surge in funding represents a preliminary measure, the processes of arms production and military expansion necessitate time and patience. President Putin's actions have galvanized NATO. During the 2000s and 2010s, the absence of a common adversary led to a dilution of NATO's defense commitments. As noted by Fyodor A. Lukyanov, NATO transitioned towards political and expansionist ambitions, prioritizing the integration of new members over the enhancement of military capabilities. In the absence of an identifiable threat, defense expenditures were curtailed. This strategy is now being recalibrated to address Russian aggression, fostering unity among NATO members against a shared antagonist. At the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, President Biden underscored NATO's collective strength, conveying an unmistakable message of enhanced unity within the alliance. The summit constituted a notable advancement, featuring participation from partner nations such as South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, thereby illustrating NATO's expansive reach and its growing focus on challenges posed by China. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated this perspective, asserting that the invasion of Ukraine endangers the foundational principles of the international order. By 2024, the defense build-up within NATO is expected to remain formidable, as indicated by the UK government, with the alliance now entrusted with safeguarding over 1 billion individuals across its member states. Despite certain internal discrepancies, NATO's perception of Russia as a threat to Europe has consolidated the bloc's unity. Current discussions are centered on optimizing defense capabilities, protecting vulnerable nations such as the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden, and contemplating the feasibility of direct intervention in Ukraine. NATO's strategic focus has demonstrably shifted towards deterring Russian aggression. An additional critical aspect of NATO's enhanced cohesion is its substantial financial assistance to Ukraine. In July 2024, NATO members concurred to furnish €40 billion, $4 billion, in military aid to Ukraine by 2025. This agreement follows the expenditure of billions thus far. By February 2024, the United States had allocated $78 billion, and the European Union had contributed $52 billion. These figures are set to escalate, with the United States approving a $60 billion aid package in April 2024, raising its total to approximately $130 billion. The increasing support for Ukraine from NATO members reflects the alliance's deeper unity and determination. NATO remains resolute in its commitment to assist Ukraine, regardless of the associated costs in time, effort, or financial resources. Member states have made significant investments in supporting Ukraine and are unlikely to retract their commitment at this juncture. The commitment to countering Russia through Ukraine has significantly strengthened the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, unifying its member states around a common adversary. Russia's actions have compelled NATO to increase its defense spending, both for its own needs and to support Ukraine, ensuring that such investments will be effectively utilized. This long-term financial commitment poses a considerable challenge to President Putin, as it undermines his ambitions in Ukraine and broader aspirations for European influence. Moreover, Russia has not acted upon its threats toward NATO, and the lackluster performance of its military in Ukraine suggests that it may not possess the formidable capabilities it is often presumed to have. Despite being regarded as one of the foremost military powers globally, Russia has become ensnared in a protracted conflict against a nation it was expected to subdue with relative ease. Although Ukraine has received substantial financial support, Russia's initial invasion faltered, allowing Kiev to galvanize international backing. NATO has arguably overestimated Russia's military capacity, while Moscow has displayed a notable inability to recognize its inherent weaknesses. This demonstrated weakness has bolstered NATO's confidence, advancing discussions about the potential deployment of troops to Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron initially broached this possibility as early as 2024, a sentiment echoed by Baltic state officials in May 2024, particularly in the context of significant Russian advances in Kharkiv. The chairman of NATO's military committee, Lieutenant Colonel Admiral Rob Bauer, has emphasized the necessity for preparedness, asserting in January 2024 that NATO is preparing for a conflict with Russia. Putin's threats have only reinforced the resolve of the alliance as member states increasingly perceive themselves as potential targets of the Kremlin. The prospect of a NATO military presence in Ukraine appears increasingly plausible compared to 2022. Even in the absence of such deployment, heightened spending and a shift in attitudes toward Russia ensure that NATO will not be caught unprepared should Putin choose to escalate hostilities. If such an escalation occurs, Russia will confront NATO from a significantly weakened position. The protracted war in Ukraine has extended beyond Putin's initial expectations, resulting in substantial losses for Russia. Estimates from the Ukrainian Finance Ministry indicate that Russia has suffered approximately 581,000 military casualties, alongside the destruction of 8,406 tanks, over 16,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 16,000 artillery systems. Russia is depleting its resources at a time when NATO member states are increasing their defense expenditures and enhancing their military capabilities. Additionally, Putin's ambitions to create a Russian equivalent to NATO have faltered. Despite entering a mutual defense agreement with North Korea, he has overseen the disintegration of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, which once included multiple former Soviet republics. Established in May 1992, the CSTO was envisioned as a counterbalance to NATO, encompassing members such as Russia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Over the years, Georgia, Belarus, and Azerbaijan also became members. However, Uzbekistan withdrew from the CSTO in 2012, and Armenia is poised to exit, as reported by The Hill in March 2024. Following a revolution that brought Nikol Pashinyan to power, Armenia suspended its participation in 2018 and feels undermined by Russia, particularly in light of Putin's failure to mediate a peace settlement regarding the Lachin corridor, which led to the displacement of 100,000 Armenians. This situation presents an opportunity for NATO to exploit Russia's inability to support its allies in crises, thereby illustrating a lack of reliability to neutral or pro-Russian states such as Belarus, Syria, and Venezuela. By doing so, NATO may diminish Russia's influence in Europe while strengthening its own position. Consequently, what options does Putin have? It is improbable that he will alter his course, as a victory in Ukraine is critical for maintaining his image as a strong leader and preserving his status within the Kremlin. However, Putin's actions in Ukraine have elicited a robust response from NATO. Member states